My guest today is Erik Hoel. He is a prolific writer, Substack author, and a parent. And this is the subject of our chat today. We talk about parenting, we talk about hard and soft pronatalism, we talk about the repugnant conclusion as it refers to pronatalism, we talk about how parenting has changed us, about meaning, about how to sell pronatalism to people. It's quite a wide ranging conversation. As usual, this is the bulk of the conversation. But if you'd like to contribute to the podcast, if you'd like to help me out and listen to the last probably 15 or 20 minutes of this chat, please do go to Substack. Link is down there, alexkashuta.com, or go to Patreon, where for a little bit less, you just get the podcast. But if you go to Substack, you get my writing as well and all the archive of pretty much everything I've written in the last few years. So if you can contribute, please do so. If not, just enjoy the show. I've really enjoyed your pieces on parenting and child rearing, all sorts of the kind of this universe of having children on a personal scale and on a collective scale. And one piece really stood out for me. It's your piece on pronatalism and its repugnant conclusion. So I wonder if you could just explain a little bit of that, maybe introduce the repugnant conclusion. I think people kind of have an instinct about what that is related to effective altruism, but then maybe just a refresher, and then why this ties into pronatalism and how that kind of works.
Thank you so much. I'm kind of in an interesting position because, I recently had kids myself, and a couple of my other, recent posts have been, quite frankly, about how great it is to have kids. I really think, just like a new child sort of has a view of the universe that maybe we should listen more to. I think, a new parent also has a little bit of that novelty effect going on, where maybe their enchantment with the whole thing is slightly closer to the reality. Similarly to a child's enchantment of the world is maybe actually closer to what the world is actually like versus our sort of more cynical adult brains. So in that sense of this enchantment, I consider myself a pro-natalist, and I think most people kind of are. Most people like kids. I think something like 70% of Americans have a kid, and then a big chunk of the remaining percentages plan to have kids. So at least on paper, our culture is a pretty soft pro-natalist culture. But at the same time, birth rates have been falling pretty significantly. You can look at all sorts of different countries. You can look at, some of the countries that are going to hit the worst are things like South Korea. And, I think that there's a reasonable argument to be made that this could be concerning at an economic level. It's sort of concerning in this broad philosophical level of like, well, there's less souls or less consciousnesses or less people to experience things, whatever you want to call it. And then that seems like, we want more people to experience more things and be conscious. But, after I looked into the numbers, after this was sort of, much trumpeted on social media, and, prominent pronatalists have been getting very large magazine pieces written about them. Elon Musk has been talking about pronatalism a lot. I couldn't look at the numbers and feel like deep concern when it came to the US once I sort of realized that most of the decline in birth rates seemed to be the decline in teen moms and women under the age of 25 getting pregnant. And it's not that I have some sort of like deep horror of that, right? Like I'm not somebody who would be like, oh, that's wonderful. It's like, well, I think it's probably good. I think people can make their own decisions. If somebody's 23 and wants to have a kid, I think and they're very confident about it. I respect people's decisions, but at the same time, it's very hard to get deeply concerned because, of course, when you look at the total overall birth rate, what's going into that are basically two factors. One of which is how fewer children people are actually having, and then the other factor is how late they're having it. And if you are sort of measuring on the distinct time slices wherein people are now delaying having kids, it's going to show up as a greater decline in the total rate. because all the people who were 22 and had kids now don't have a kid at that moment when you time slice it. And probably, they'll recoup those children to some degree later on. So I think this sort of like falling off a cliff dynamic, when you look at the age brackets and you break it down by age brackets, it doesn't look sort of nearly as concerning, because then you're in this weird position of saying, well, it's not that we want women who are 33 to now we, in order to sort of recoup the losses of 20-year-olds not having kids, now we need people who are like 20, 32, 33 to have more children than they were having like 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And that seems like a little bit unrealistic. And I know I'm taking a little while to get to the repugnant conclusion, like
No
part of
worries.
this, but just to sort of say, the repugnant conclusion is this utilitarian or a thought experiment sort of against utilitarianism. It's supposed to be a reductio, but sometimes people just bite the bullet and take it very seriously, which is the sort of famous philosophical example is you have two planets, planet A, planet B. Planet A has like 100 million people and they all have a very high quality of life. And then planet B has like 10 trillion people, but it's all like Bangladesh slums. Like it's all just a slum planet where there's people are raised in horrible conditions, but they all have, just barely on average, like a positive quality of life. And that adds up so much that however you're judging quality of life, it doesn't really matter. Planet B outweighs planet A. And so similarly, when I see these pronatalists, I think sort of hammering on this point for political purposes, what you're really asking is either like let's return to having more teen moms, or I think, women in their 30s should be having, twice as many kids as they did 20 or 30 years ago. And when it comes to that, it does seem like almost like families, funnily enough, face a little sort of repugnant conclusion, philosophical choice of their own, wherein, yes, you could have 8 children and your utils, or however you want to measure it, quality of life, etc., when you sum over those 8 children, would probably be higher than if you just had, 2 or 3 kids. And it's very tough for me to get too worked up about someone choosing to have 2 or 3 kids when you sort of put it like that, because then it just becomes obvious that it's just some, particular case of the repugnant conclusion.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how pronatalist, which at least in kind of the circles that I travel in, are kind of coded as right wing, and they very much converge with effective altruists, which are sometimes seen as very like against the whole field. So there's always a tension between them. But I think this, like you said, this utilitarian maximization calculus is very similar, even though it's they probably wouldn't like to be converging that way. But yeah, like I mentioned before we started recording, I was very much into a more hard flavor of pronatalism maybe a year or two ago. But then I think what I bristled at a little bit is that the type of marketing and the type of propaganda or push that is implied in this is a very like strict version of carrot and stick. It was, the carrot was clearly that, you have to maximize, as many children as you can, have them younger as well. That's definitely a bullet that people want to bite on the right wing. But the problem was that, okay, on the other end, your life would be devoid of meaning. You're wasting your life. There's pretty much no other avenue for meaning for you if you missed the boat on kid maxing. So the problem I saw is that, this is a repugnant marketing, because it doesn't really work. And it strengthens the resolve of people who already, are choosing this path and saying, okay, this is the only way. And I think it's probably good for building some sort of in-group, I don't know, lore and power, and strengthening the ideals between people who already have chosen this path. But as making it enticing for people to want to have as many children as possible, I think it's a much harder sell, because like you said, most people are soft prenatalists, people who don't have children. Usually you do want them, maybe they haven't found ways, and just this very kind of harsh push into that direction just feels very counterintuitive. And I do think that people like Brian Happen, for example, I think they convince more people to have children, more children, than some of the harder pronatalists.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it was interesting, thinking about some of these issues. I was sort of waffling on this notion of, is our culture sort of pro family messaging, or is it anti family messaging? And I think it very depends on sort of where you look in the culture. If you just think about the importance of families, I mean, first of all of our like successful presidents recently have basically been members of incredibly powerful families. I mean, Obama is essentially the exception, but of course the Trumps are all like one massive family that's heavily involved with each other. The Bidens as well are essentially like a power family, and and that seems to be reflected in the culture more broadly. I mean, you can say what you will about Keeping Up with the Kardashians, but it is about family. And say with still Disney movies and kids shows and so on. But I do think that if you look at the very sort of more messaging on the elite side, if you look at the New York Times, or you look at the New Yorker, or you look at Time Magazine, or you look at the Guardian, I'm naming places that have all had really substantial op-eds in the past couple of years that have argued against having kids, in the sense of parents literally saying, I regret having children, I don't like being a parent, and so on. And to a certain degree, I think that that's a great example of what sometimes dubbed a luxury belief, wherein actually a lot of the people who are reading the New Yorker do actually end up having stable marriages and have children. Maybe they don't have 4 children, but they do end up having children. But so I think it's sort of like, what you don't want is an elite that is separated from the fundamentals of life, and that includes an experience with children. I don't think that having children is the only way to get meaning out of life. I think that there are other ways, right? You can have intellectual journeys, spiritual journeys. You can have a very meaningful career. There's all sorts of ways, but I do think children are like this very fast shortcut. It's almost like a cheat code, where just suddenly your life is just way more meaningful by doing this thing that effectively everybody has done since the beginning of time, and we're all sort of endowed with this natural capacity. And yeah, so I think I think I've become a little bit more like conflicted about it when it comes to is this actually like a massive problem? Do we need to sort of be like consciously, explicitly aware about it, aware of it, and make it into something political? And then I think if one does, there certainly seems to be more like sensible policy conclusions to provide like support for mothers, than asking people to have 7 or 8 kids to sort of offset some sort of demographic imbalance.
Yeah, and the fact that it's just so kind of intrinsically politically coded just really makes it even more of a harder sell. It's like, okay, this is for X faction because it has the language of, it's obviously very much tied into religion, but the idea of someone, Kaplan style, just having one extra kid, and this is a message that can travel far and wide, and can travel across the aisle. I think that's, on the whole, for the addressable market, the total addressable market is pretty much anyone who's contemplating having children. So I think that's why I think hard pronatalism is a little bit tougher to sell. And yeah, I've started kind of detaching myself a little bit from that.
Yeah, there's sort of this interesting question of like, how do you get to the point intellectually where you would say, oh, it like makes sense to have 7 or 8 kids? I mean, given what we know about how hard frankly, parenting is in the modern world. You really
Wow.
can't, certain avenues are closed to you. You simply can't go tell your kids to go play outside all day because, but quite frankly, because I just wrote a whole piece about this and asked for people's feedback on sort of their child protective services stories. That is a way to get CPS called on you, right? Is just to have your kids outside playing by themselves, somewhere that's not like right in front of your house. So society has closed certain avenues that make having large numbers of children easier and more feasible. That includes also like things like cost of food, even like or through inflation. I mean, I'm sure you know exactly how much raspberries and blueberries cost, and it's obscene, and like we're just all being robbed blind. And I do think that there's sort of this intellectual question of like, if there's sort of this weird amalgamation of genetic determinism that you need to believe in order to take sort of like a kid maxing perspective. Like in order to really believe that it's relevant to, I mean, let's take a case, like Elon, who has, I don't even know how many children at this point. And I don't mean to, like really like directly insult him here, but there's just no way that somebody, even with all the resources that Elon has, can operate effectively as as a standard father figure for 12 or 13 children or however many it is now, right? I think in order to sort of do that, you have to have this belief that genes will out, and that aspects of the parental role are sort of exaggerated. And I do think that there's like research that people can lean on to support those beliefs, but I think that research is surprisingly oversold. I think it's based off of we now have a clearer understanding of how replicability is a really big problem for a lot of the sciences, particularly a lot of things like psychology. And frankly, a lot of the stuff that was showing, that intelligence and drive and all these things are like 60 to 80% heritable. And I'm just speaking broadly. A lot of that stuff is based off of very old studies, and some of those old studies were, in fact, all of them were done before people were pre-registering to get results, before a lot of the sort of the scientific apparatus came into play, after we realized that 60 of 100 psychology studies just like flat out don't replicate. And so I think that there's sort of this like weird reliance where people want to say, oh, I'm following the science, and I'm really delving into this like hardcore truth that no one wants to admit, and then like the citations are all like pretty poorly controlled 1960s twin studies with pretty small sample sizes, and the results aren't pre-registered, and the predictions aren't registered ahead of time, and just all the stuff that we would now want to be done in like modern scientific studies just weren't being done. And so I think there's been a little bit of like a laundering of the notion of heritability as being so high as to be being effectively determinate. Sometimes people will say things like, oh, parenting doesn't matter, or so on. And then if you sort of follow those citational links, they often do end up back at old twin studies that the records aren't great, and people have criticized them a lot for like how they actually divided up and grouped the twins, and were people actually putting twins into random families, or were they trying to find very similar families for each twin? That's been a consistent criticism. And so that's sort of my read on it, is that some of this stuff is like this old intellectual legacy that has slowly sort of worked this way through, and there's some truth to it, in the sense of definitely a lot of traits are genetically have a big genetic component. I would be the first person to say that, But the very high sort of pure like determining numbers, the kind of numbers where we'd say, well, yeah, just go and have 8 to 10 kids, you're going to get the same results in terms of their psychologies and personalities and outcomes as you would if you had 2 to 3 and were sort of like a more, or even 4 and were more of like an involved.
Yeah, I think just inherently extremely difficult to do these studies, and I would imagine nowadays doing twins, random parts type studies would be ethically not acceptable. I'm
Yeah,
not
so
sure, but
it's funny. Sometimes studies still do come out, but they're on the old twins. So now the twins in the study are like 65 or something, right? But it is true that it's like the kind of thing that you just can't really do anymore. It's funny how this happens in science. I recently had an exploration of the efficacy of bed nets because you mentioned effective altruism, and a huge part of the effective altruist brand is in sort of the maximum bang for the minimal buck, and um, a lot of it is on these bed nets, hopefully saving children's lives from malaria and on their effectiveness. But if you sort of go into like, how do they know that this is actually super effective? The honest truth is that it's these old randomized controlled trials, and they can't do them anymore. You can't even do randomized controlled trials on bed nets really anymore because everybody has them, and they have a familiarity with them, and you can't like take 2 villages, give one village a certain bed nets, and then sort of like keep the bed nets from the other villages, which is exactly what people were doing. First of all, just even now, just due to ethical reasons, because people just assume that it is very effective. So even there's all sorts of things like that in the modern world, wherein these older forms of science, things done before, back when maybe data wasn't shared publicly, when like all these things, and then you can't do certain things anymore. Like you really would have a very tough time figuring out a way to do some sort of new twin study.
yeah, and I think generally, I think this applies to a lot of studies that try to measure heritability because essentially, just by definition, there's covariance in there for all sorts of traits. Obviously, the parents who have desirable traits then also maybe are more conscientious, tend to take their kids to after school programs, read to them, all these types of stuff. It's like that study where kids who have books in the home read at earlier ages. I'm like, yes, of course they do, but then it's very hard to take this out without something like an exotic experiment, natural or otherwise, like a film study. So I wonder what, maybe now with like genome-wide association studies and things like that, there's going to be a kind of a new way to look at this that's not as invasive. But yeah, for now, I think we're kind of in that lull where people have to go back to the 1960s because that's literally the only thing they have, and they're probably impressed by those results because I know maybe they also want to believe this type of stuff. So obviously, this people have a
Yeah,
certain
I do think that it would be naive to say that there aren't political reasons that like this idea that you can have strong stances on heredity, and that's not fundamentally going to impact very broadly what you believe politically or what you want people to believe politically. I think it absolutely does. But the issue is that we actually still really don't know very much about it. You mentioned the gene-wide association studies. Well, if you look at those and you compare those to the earlier twin studies, they're like an order of magnitude lower almost every time. I mean, just the overall conclusion of them have been that by just looking at genes and then trying to correlate it to contemporary traits, like just actually taking people's genomes and looking at the genetics and trying to predict everything from height to IQ to educational attainment, the numbers have been sort of spectacularly low in comparison to the heritability estimates from twin studies, and this is known in the literature as the missing heritability problem. And it seems to me that effectively, when there's like an open scientific question, that there's literally a name for this mystery where like people don't know which of these is correct. Is it that IQ really is 60-70% determined by genetics, like the twin studies show, or is it like literally 10 to maybe at best 20% via like the genome-wide association studies? So which is it? And it seems like people are sort of playing a little bit of a choose your own adventure, in that they're choosing to sort of believe one side of this rather than the other side, and that's mainly to sort of fit whatever whatever like narrative they have. Like I don't know which of those estimates is correct. I think it's weird that given everything we know now, given how good our even just the evolution of our statistics, given that we are doing, genome sequencing in ways that, were completely impossible now, it's weird that we are not getting some sort of deep climb, this continuing climb of heritability. Instead, we're sort of getting like lower percentages than you might think, like lower percentages than even the average person would estimate, probably like off the top of their head. Like most people actually, if you ask, is IQ, how heritable is IQ, people will often say like 50-50. Like they'll say like pretty high numbers. And then these numbers like aren't even close to that. So it's like, it's unclear to me, but I do think that if someone is sort of putting together all these pieces into some sort of comprehensive political vision, then there's definitely some cherry picking going on.
I think it's kind of inherent that there's cherry picking, and there's always like these strange bundling of issues on both sides of the aisle. For example, you would say this is more of a like genetic determinism would be more of a right-wing thing, but at the same time you have these issues like fatherlessness or daycare, or the exposure to daycare of children, or all sorts of kind of influences within their lives that's corrupting influences on people that they steer their lives into nefarious directions. So there's definitely a lot of cherry picking on both sides. There's, people might say, okay, I'm Judith Rich Harris pilled on all of this stuff, but actually they have a whole list of things that are politically maybe convenient, or or the topic du jour that's destroying the youth. On both sides, I'm sure there's a lot.
And it is definitely true that the both sides. I mean, there's it's very hard to say that there hasn't been some sort of political bias to try to make sure that heritability estimates like aren't too high, or to address certain questions around heritability or something. But at the same time, I think that you could say the same things about the other side. Like it's just a question that is so inherently loaded that even when you try to tackle it in like a fair manner, you often end up skewing it one way or another, because it's so like hot button as an issue. And so I think it's sort of one of those things where like, it's unfortunate. It would be nice to think that someone could just go in and like handle the heritability literature in such a way that you could never accuse them of bias. But I think probably like the object that you're holding is so white hot that you're effectively like juggling it no matter what you end up saying about it. I mean, that's sort of my conclusion from looking at it. You either have to have these like huge margins where you say like, I really don't know, and that's really the honest take, or you have some more like particular conclusion, and then at that point you're like handling this like super white hot object where you're saying, oh, it's actually only 5%, so people are blank slates, or you're saying, oh, it's actually 75%, so and then the remaining 20% is like non-shared environment woo woo, and so therefore we should basically be genetic determinists about it. And it's just very, very, very hard to not end up in either of those camps.
Yeah, I think it's just, I think that's just the nature of how discourse on any sort of topic works, and how this polarization, how these waves kind of crest and wane. And there was kind of this topic was off the table, no one talked about it. Now, because of kind of the subculture on the internet and bubbling up, now it's on a lot of people's minds, and it's kind of taken over. And it's I just feel like people are very have a very hard time dealing with ambiguity on things. They really want to collapse that ambiguity, and it's very hard to like you said, handle this white hot object in a good way. And maybe even if you're someone who really is committed to finding the truth, audience capture, just the nature of writing on the internet, of presenting your ideas, of finding an audience, means that you will slowly get funneled to one side or the other, just because, I don't know, you need to make an income. It takes a long time to sift through this literature, and people are craving the collapsing of ambiguity. They want to know what is real. Is it this or that, nature or nurture? And in between is not an answer people like. I've noticed this myself.
But I do think I mean it's yeah, I'd also be lying if I said my opinion on this didn't shift a little bit after having kids and feeling that you could see cause and effect. I mean, and I'm sure you felt this, where you felt, oh, even small things like, oh, they slept well because, I figured out this trick, with their binky, where you, tie it to, a stuffed animal, so then they can fondle it, but they don't have to have it in their mouth. So now I'm not concerned about the binky, and now they're still sleeping well again. And you figure out like these like little tips and tricks, and it's not that, the children are like these mechanical automata where you can put in interventions and get like super predictable effects, but you sometimes you sometimes see that an intervention, really does fundamentally work. And I do think, my wife was at the beach recently, and we live out on Cape Cod, so or during the summer they're always at the beach. And there was this group of people there, probably out of towners visiting for the July 4th weekend, and this young 9-year-old girl, this like baby duck family came by, this mama duck with all their baby ducks in tow, and this girl went into the water and separated out the baby ducks from the mama duck. And, the mama duck's having like a panic attack. The babies are freaking out. Everybody at the beach is sort of like, what are you doing? This is like psychopathic. And the girl's just like laughing. And, I do think that if I were to have just started laughing hysterically at that, not that I feel any urge to, but like imagine some world in which I'm like, ha ha ha, that is actually very funny. I am absolutely sure that in the next 10 minutes, my child would have gone to go chase some ducks somewhere. My child, by the way, is 3, not 9. So just turned 3. So, very minimal prefrontal cortex. But I'm like absolutely certain that, if I were somebody who goes and throws stones at animals, they would throw stones at animals. I'm just so certain that exists within like every single person. And the more time I spend witnessing parenting, the more I'm sort of impressed that there are, mothers and fathers out there who are essentially ensuring that the people who grow up are not people who throw stones at ducks and therefore effectively cannot have a civilization, right? Like this whole, it just becomes much more obvious to me that this whole thing, all of it, just depends on mothers intervening and be like, oh, you have to share your toys, and like you have to be nice, and it's not funny when you're wantonly cruel to things. Because I think humans are hunters. I think that we for a very long time that's what we did, and frankly the fact that most people who are adults live in the adult world and don't really get off on cruelty is not so much this genetically determined thing as it is very much this cultural thing, because you can see it in kids where like if one kid in the group starts behaving badly or whacking other kids, the other kids will all start getting like more rambunctious and sort of rowdy and start like taking on their characteristics and so on. Like it's so easy to slip into some sort of primordial psychopathic state, especially early, and then kids get resistance to it because they live as a civilized being for long enough that it begins to look, even by the time they're 3 or 4, they begin to have a sense of what's mean and what's nice, and and to have like a distaste. But it doesn't seem to me to be like this deeply genetic thing, because again, you can just go to any group of kid and watch that, because you'll see these tremors spread out among the children if one kid is really behaving poorly or badly. And that's the kind of thing that makes me more impressed by the role of parents, in that, like, I really don't think that you would just, if all the parent vanished. There's a great sci-fi story, by the way, about that guy who wrote the Three Body Problem, where in this world there's some sort of gamma burst or something, and it kills all the people with older DNA, and like the only people left are all under 12, and it's sort of like the world that they inherit, and they are all like marginally psychopathic, because it's all like children games, and the children's games become mixed with violence. So yeah, I just like I've sort of had this change of just watching parenting happening, and like watching somebody try to instill like the values of civilization into people, of like, you have to be able to share, you have to not mistreat animals, you can't get joy out of crushing bugs. Like, you can crush a bug because it's in your room, but you shouldn't be delighted that you are crushing the bug, right? You have to be sad or neutral about the bug's demise.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with your idea that kind of parents are the transmitters, the supporter, the conduits of people actually becoming civilized, and yeah, that wouldn't happen without the parents. What I have noticed, though, and that would kind of strengthen a little bit of my belief in heritability, and just in not necessarily, maybe not like strict heritability, but not that my children aren't blank slates, because they are clearly, at least to me, almost, fully formed sets of characteristics. And, since birth, they were very different. They have different personality, they have different strengths and weaknesses. They're kind of like video game characters. They're completely differently configured. And it's been very clear, like, who is, extremely extroverted, who is less so, who is kind of contemplative, more technically inclined, verbally inclined, all this type of stuff. And I have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. And, they're very small. So pretty much theoretically at blank slate level, but they are completely different. And it's, there's a lot of stuff that's inbuilt. And like, especially for my baby now, he's just going to turn 1 in August. He, you can see, at least, to me, it seems like there's an extremely complex being in there with terrible control of his faculties. He's really trying so hard. He's training every day for the walking, for the fine motor control. He's like, my first boy, he's like this kind of extroverted Viking type, just like a destroyer, just like completely crazy. But this guy, he's just been training for civilization every day. He knows that this is his goal. He needs to be walking. He needs to be, putting things, fine motor control, introduce the object into the smaller object, just completely doing all the puzzles. So it's so interesting. Like, he's really trying to figure out the equipment. It's just so from this perspective, I think, okay, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that comes prepackaged with the child, and they're kind of discovering. But obviously that doesn't diminish my role as someone who has to assist them in doing this. But there's also kind of the idea of kind of gene culture coevolution. Like, we have an extremely, I say this as someone from Romania. I'm not part of kind of the Anglo-Germanic core that influences the West, but there is this kind of the strictness of civilization, and the parameters of what it means to be civilized in the West are slightly different, at least from what evolved, or what happens to be the case in other places, which just evolve on different parameters. I mean, there is some universals, obviously, there are some, but not everything is universal everywhere. So it does, you could say this is, genetically based, or it's just a completely different culture for whatever reasons. But yeah, it's there are differences, and I don't know. I wonder what your take on this is. Obviously, kind of a very spicy universe of thought. But yeah, one wonders when you have children. You're like, okay, what? Where does this come from? And yeah, it seems to me like I can contribute, but to a limit, to an extent.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree. I just think that it's again something. This is like the funnily enough, which is that if you just get like, we think of it as like, oh, talking about heritability is this deeply edgy thing. It's like, well, actually, most parents are more than willing to share their opinions about this, and their opinions are usually that their children are just like genetically different and came out came out, different in particular ways. I certainly feel the exact same way. But I do think that there's a certain broadness to it. It's like if somebody has like a short temper or something, I really think that there's probably, as I'm, how old were your kids? How old are your kids?
1 and 3.
Okay, so we're literally on the exact same plane. I have a 3-year-old boy and a 1-year-old girl, and I'm suspecting that the 1-year-old girl is gonna have like a little bit of a short temper. She's absolutely an angel, but then when she gets mad like so fast, and it's like the ramp up is very high. So and like I suspect that, and that's going to be more than made up for by her extroversion, and she seems very sort of smart and kind of wise and so on. But I can definitely see that difference like already, and it's not like anything we've done something really significant that would change change something like that. But then I do think that there's sort of this question of like, okay, well, if you're somebody with a short temper, like how do you deal with that, right? And it's not so much of like, oh, you're gonna not actually ever have a short temper. It's gonna be things like when you get mad, leave, like remove yourself from the situation, because people who get mad fast also calm down fast. So you just get yourself out of the situation if you're mad about it, and then you can calm yourself and then get back in it. And that's an example of like an emotionally regulating thing that an adult can teach a child, right? And so I think, like, I definitely think too that some of these heritability estimates are because we think about these traits, and our measurements for these traits are so broad. It's something like, oh, is extroversion heritable or something like that, and it's like, well, yeah, probably, but there's all sorts of different actual distinct sub flavors of extroversion that people can possess. And I think that that's sort of where the work of a parent gets done, of like, you want to be extroverted, but you don't want to be foolishly annoying. You want to be extroverted, but you want to, or sometimes for an introvert it's like, well, you can be introverted, but I'm also going to force you out into doing more team sports or something like that to really like get you out of your shell or something. And so I think there's sort of this question of, even when people do the tests for like, oh, is personality heritable, you're still just dealing with things like the big five, and then within that there's this universe of we all know differentiations within people's personalities, where there's sort of all these like fine-tuned little like subtle touches. And I'm not saying that they get all of that from their parents, probably get a lot of that from their both shared environment and non-shared environment. But I think that that's sort of like where it goes in. Like, that's another reason to sort of be a little bit skeptical when we're just dealing with really broad like questions. Then you're gonna get sort of this overestimation, because you're looking at this like big coarse graining of just like, is this person introverted or is this person extroverted, versus if you had some very fine coarse graining, maybe genetics would start to matter a little bit less.
Yeah, I think it's it's just such an extremely multifaceted issue, and it's also constantly evolving. I mean, I see myself, my personality has changed quite drastically throughout my life, just depending on what I've exposed myself to, the situations of my life, probably just getting older as well. And obviously this happens on an accelerated pace with children. So I think it's pretty tough to end up in one camp or the other. But in terms of just meaning and just the quality of experience, what do you see as a big change, or what are the changes you felt in your life individually from becoming a parent?
So I think I was saying earlier about meaning that there are other paths to meaning in life, and so I'll just very quickly reiterate that about people go on religious journeys and so on. But the simple truth is that most people don't go meditate on a mountain, but most people don't. Most people live pretty standard lives, and then they just do that with or without a child. And even with things like career, and I certainly think career is important. But again, if you're sort of like telling hard truths, most people aren't emergency cardiac surgeons saving people every day. Most people are not, members of the Supreme Court. Most people are not even like if you take the class of most scientists, the simple truth is that a horrible truth is just due to things like the Pareto distribution, you could probably remove 90% of the lower end of scientists and science would get along just fine. Because so much of it is done by these like very small number of individuals who are just like domain experts and they have like 30,000 citations. That's sort of true of almost everything, right? Which is that just due to how the things like the Pareto distribution shows up, it's very hard to really seriously matter through work. And I think that there's a sense in which even I have my AC on behind me, so like even like an HVAC technician, there's a certain like honor in that it is actually very important to keep people too cold or too hot. There's all sorts of studies on like the effect of temperature on cognition, and so it's like you're contributing in like real ways, by being like an HVAC technician. But I think if you were to ask, are you getting deep cosmic meaning from being an HVAC technician? Most HVAC technicians would probably answer no. They don't get some sort of fundamental human cosmic meaning from that. And I think that sort of scales up way higher than we'd like it. I think that there's like the elite human capital likes to believe that there's some like really big difference in meaning between working a mid-level job at Google or Amazon and being like an HVAC technician. But the simple truth is that if you are like a mid-level employee at Google or Amazon, like most of your income comes from selling ads. You sell ads, your company sells ads. You probably don't. You're probably some other subset, but like that's where the actual fundamental income of your company comes from. And in a lot of cases, and it's just sort of trickling down. And so we all sort of like know this and are willing to admit this, what at like an individual level. And so I think the pro argument for kids is sort of like, well, kids is sort of like a way around the fact that I'm not somebody who like rails against capitalism on the regular by any means, but it is true that capitalism doesn't afford a massive amount of cosmic meaning for most people, given sort of our self-organized structure of the whole thing. And again, I don't think that's a problem because I think that it's fine if people get their meaning from other places. But I do think it's a little bit of it's quite the risk to say I'm gonna definitely be able to get my meaning. Like even myself, I'm very lucky in that I get to sort of think and write for a living. That's very rare. But the world would get along just fine, without me. Like it'd be fine. Like how much am I like really contributing? I've had like a couple original scientific ideas, but it's like it's a pretty small handful of like actually really original stuff. And so I think that's true for pretty high up in sort of the elite human capital production domain. So that's sort of like this, like it's a very negative pitch for having kids, and it's a very like parent oriented case, obviously. But I do think that reflects for me my biggest change. I forget, I'm not the one who came up with this, but I think I read it somewhere. But it's like when you have kids, it's like your utility function suddenly started walking around outside of yourself, right? So it's like, oh, suddenly, you care a great deal about like what food they're eating, and you care way less about what food you're eating. You care more about and what are they being entertained versus are you being entertained. And that's a pretty sizable shift. And certainly I don't think that just having kids, I think you could have kids and have sort of like a very depressed materialistic view of the universe. I still think you could do that. It's not like automatic, but I think it's very hard to not get some sort of meaning boost that's non-negative from having kids. And that's certainly been my own experience.
Yeah, no, I could definitely second that. And I just kind of remember, the time before I had kids, because the time before you have kids and the time you actually have kids. I not to diminish, the role of the father, but as a mother, even like on a very visceral, like hormonal level, like things change, like in extreme ways. Um, I remember I kind of had to talk myself into it, but I had one of my biggest revelations was because I don't have this whole baby fever, extreme maternal instinct thing. Unfortunately, it doesn't, it's not a feature of mine. But the idea that I've had, millennia upon millennia of ancestors just struggling, by the skin of their teeth to reproduce, to get to me, to be like, well, you know what, I could take it or leave it, whatever. It just felt like just just
Let
like
people down.
spitting in, yeah, into the essence of existence. Just like completely defaulting on my role as as a creature on Earth. And somehow that was a big part of my calculus. Also, I can't lie, Jordan Peterson participated there. I was just like really like maps of meaning. Yeah, I think this is new stuff. So it kind of put me on that path as well. So I kind of had to have a bit of a, a vision quest to get to this point. But obviously, after I've had kids, yeah, things has changed completely. Yeah, it's a weird thing, because I have a few people in my circle who deciding or have decided to be childless, by choice, whatever circumstances they have, and it's hard for me to not be like this annoying cheerleader saying, just don't know what you're missing, especially because I'm all disheveled. I've lost sleep. You're obviously not in a good way. You knew me before, and now I'm like, I'm not in my prime. So this, it's taken definitely about 10 years, put it on top of my existing score. But at the same time, it doesn't matter. So many things don't matter anymore. And like you said, the utility function is completely appended. And yeah, it's a hard sell, but I think the honest sell is a better sell than this, your life will end. You're a terrible person for not having children, and yeah, it's just not convincing. And yeah, even this sell is not very convincing, but I'm doing my best.
It's almost I found that it's very difficult to explain because you have all sorts of disadvantages, right, when you're talking about the benefits of parenting. Like one is that clearly so many people have done this throughout time that it's sort of like a deeply unimpressive like thing to go do. It's also, people have heard all the messaging before. Like people know that people like being parents. And it's just one of those things where it just feels very different from the inside. There's a famous philosophical thought experiment called Mary the Color Scientist. And in Mary the Color Scientist, there's this woman named Mary who is an expert neuroscientist, but she grows up and she focuses on vision. But she's raised in this very strange way where she's raised without any color. So she's raised in a totally black and white room and reads black and white books and you watches everything in black and white and never she knows a great deal. In fact, she knows everything there is to know about the visual processing in the brain. And so she has all that information, explicit. And then, she's shown red for the first time. Like maybe someone leaves like a red rose, in her black and white room. And the question is she surprised? Like, does she gain any information? And the argument goes that if she's gained any information, there has to be this explanatory gap, wherein you really can't derive consciousness from just sort of like knowing things about, say, the visual cortex. But putting aside that, I do think that some things in life are like Mary, the color scientist, where you can explain to someone from the outside, until you're blue in the face, but really you sort of have to be on the inside to really actually like finally.
If you enjoyed this conversation up to this point, you will also enjoy the extended version of the conversation, which is over on Substack. That's at alexkashuta.com or on patreon.com/aksubversive. Patreon has just a podcast, and Substack has a community, the back catalog of all my writing, a lot more archival things, a few more exclusive episodes. So it's slightly more of an enhanced version of the show. I really appreciate any sort of contribution that listeners can make. I don't have ads. I mean, except for if you're watching this on YouTube, you probably saw a few YouTube ads. I'm trying to, monetize a little bit on YouTube, but in general, I don't have ads. If you want to listen to podcasts, there are no ads on it. So essentially, subscriptions is the only thing that works, and I really, really do appreciate if you could make a contribution. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode.